All right, good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're really excited to be here with all of you tonight to talk about High School Students Unite, teen activism, education reform, and FBI surveillance in post-war America. We're here with the author, Dr. Aaron G. Fountain Jr., and he's here in conversation with Dr. Carl Suddler. And we saw this book in the catalog months ago and reached out to Aaron because we were like, this book is so timely, it's so important. We didn't know that it would be literally quite so timely that students would be walking out this weekend. But students are always engaging in various ways of activism, and so we're really, really excited to have this history with us right now that feels so vital. And I'm very excited to have Vox with us tonight as our co-host. Vox ATL is Atlanta's home for uncensored teen publishing and self-expression. Vox is a teen-driven professional space and a learning environment for teens in Metro Atlanta. So if you're from Vox, if you're a teen from Vox and you're here, I would love for you to shout out where you're watching from in the city in the chat. We also would love for you to be involved in the chat. Tell us about your activism, ask questions. That's really part of why we're here tonight. I am a Vox alum, and so much of what I've learned about being an activist was about doing youth organizing. And that really helped shape how I thought about future organizing as an adult. So I really think that youth organizing is so important, and I'm really excited that both of these professors focus on youth organizing as a part of their work. So Dr. Carl Suddler is an associate professor of history at Emory University. His research, teaching, and public scholarship place him among a select number of scholars specializing in the intersections of Black life, crime, and sports since the late 19th century. Suddler's first book, Presumed Criminal: Black Youth and the Justice System in Post-War New York, has garnered significant academic usage across college and graduate classrooms and contributes to the burgeoning literature on the American carceral state, criminalization, and mass incarceration. He co-edited a special issue of The American Historian that provided context for global protests following the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And in 2021, he consulted the Harvard University's Global Sports Initiative to inform professional athletes on leveraging their platforms for social justice. Suddler's expertise is highly sought by scholarly communities and prominent media outlets. His second book is out, Policing the Field, Black Athlete. Not out. No, not out yet. It's still in the, sorry, I'm stressing you out. It's on its way. He is at work on it. Policing the Field, Black Athletes, Carceral Boundaries, and the Fight for Freedom in U.S. Sports. We're not gonna rush you to the altar, Carl. I apologize, but we're excited for it. We're hype, and it is necessary. It's going to be a necessary contribution to the field. So welcome. We're glad you're here. And the man of the hour is Dr. Aaron G. Fountain Jr. He is a historian who studies high school student activism in the 1960s and 70s, covering themes of education, race, political radicalism, and surveillance. He holds a doctorate in history from Indiana University and a Bachelor of Arts in history from Winthrop University in Rock Hill, South Carolina. He writes and presents public talks about 20th century American political and social history. This book, High School Students Unite, Teen Activism, Education Reform, and FBI Surveillance in Postwar America, is hot off the presses from UNC Press. He's also begun a second book project, which is a cultural and political history of teenagers in the Vietnam War in North America, Australia, and New Zealand. In addition to multiple academic articles, Dr. Fountain's writing has appeared in Time, Smithsonian Magazine, Al Jazeera, The Hill, and many other outlets. His freelance essays explore themes of student activism, race and ethnicity, and online misogyny. So welcome, Dr. Fountain. We're so glad you're here. Congratulations on your new book. We would love for folks to feel free to put questions in the chat at any time. And I'm going to get out of the way and let this conversation begin.
Thanks, ER. So good evening, everyone. I don't have to introduce myself or Dr. Fountain now because of that fantastic introduction, but I do want to add a little bit of color to the conversation before we dive in. and just want to reveal some personal connections that might not be readily available to all of our listeners and folks who will watch this at a future date. So, first, Aaron and I both graduated with PhDs from the Department of History at Indiana University in Bloomington. Um, I'm wearing a Hoosiers hat now. It's upside down to for different kinds of reasons. But we did overlap briefly, if memory serves me correctly, Aaron. Um, your first year overlapped with my last year, which would have been like academic year 2014-15, which makes me feel super old at this point. Um, and then on top of this connection, fast forward to the book writing process, and any of our listeners who've written academic books and are familiar with the process. When I got the email from UNC Press to review said book manuscript on high school student activism, I was excited for what was in store. And then when I learned it was Aaron's book, I had to get my heavy-handed blind reviewer pen out, and offer as much feedback and critique and suggestions for revisions as possible. And so I share all that information before we begin, because I want to use some of the top of our time here to tell you, Aaron, that I'm proud of you, man. I'm proud to see this book in the world. I'm proud of your resilience, and not just the resilience required to finish the book, from filing nearly 1,700 FOIA requests, conducting over 70 oral history interviews to ensure the voices that made this project come together aren't forgotten, but also to your resilience as a person to keep fighting for your space, in this industry that regularly excludes too many of the kind of people we need the most in it. And so I'm proud that you're able to get these kinds of opportunities to talk about your work, because I know that it has meant a lot for you. It's been a long time coming, and as timely as a moment as possible as we kind of watch this next generation of students in Atlanta and across the country, walk out of classrooms to make their voices heard. So again, thank you, Aaron, for being with us here tonight. And so, was that too much of a thanks? I know you don't like all the, the
No, I
kind
was
of
actually going to tell you some things I never told you before.
oh,
I just for listeners who don't know,
uh,
Carl's two things I want to say. I never told Carl this. I sincerely appreciate the fact that when my dad passed away the first year of grad school, he reached out to me and took me out to a restaurant and chatted. That was
mhm,
really meaningful for me because, as you can imagine, untimely loss of a parent is, has quite an effect on somebody. And another thing I also want to tell Carl is that I admire the fact that where he's at now at Emory University, because we were in graduate school, I remember a professor was interviewing for a position in the department, and they went around the room and asked people, "What are your academic goals?" And everybody's kind of reluctant, saying, like, I hope I get an academic job. And then Carl said, "I work too hard. I'm going for an R1." And at the time, I'm like, man, this dude is arrogant as you know what. And lo and behold, when he finished, he did just what he said he was going to do. And for
mhm,
me, I have to admire stuff like that when people 100% are committed to what they want to do and don't let any roadblocks or criticism get to them and they achieve it. Then I just tip my hat off to them and give a round of applause. So I didn't want to say that. I wish I could say that in person and stuff. And I'm like, I got to tell him that when we talk.
Nah, I I appreciate that. Yeah, we could exchange stories about Bloomington all day, but yeah, no, it was, certainly a time, and sometimes that arrogance might have come back to bite me in the tail. But I'm glad I'm in a position that I am now for sure. So, but I appreciate that for sure, Aaron. Let's dive into some of these questions. We got a lot of people in the chat. Again, the collaboration with Vox was important for this event tonight. And I think one of the questions so we'll start off with some book related questions specifically, and then we'll open it up a bit to think about kind of the histories connections to this kind of current moment, because we definitely want to tap in there. But my first question that I wanted to ask you was, why high schoolers? I think most people assume that high schoolers, especially in the 1960s, were just sort of like extensions of college student activism, right? Like they were copying college students in places like Berkeley or Columbia. But your book actually makes the argument that they were leading their own unique kind of charge. And so what was it about high school environment that made these students feel they had to organize independently in their own kind of way?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. As I told somebody else, I think high school student activism is more representative of youth culture. By 1970, there's only about 7.4 million students enrolled in college, whereas in high school, it's like 14, a little over 14 million, close to 15 million students enrolled in college. So if you're trying to see the landscape of what issues are affecting youth, I think high school is where you have to go. Like I tell people this all the time. I came across the topic by accident. I was an undergraduate at Winthrop University with a history major with ambitions to go to graduate school. And then I stumbled into the McNair Scholars Program. And of course, you have to do an original summer research project for that. I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I remember thinking about doing something on the Friendship Nine, civil rights, but pretty much a civil rights story that occurred in Rock Hill, South Carolina. A group of 10 students, but it later became nine, intentionally went to jail with the purpose of not paying bail. But my professor was like, oh, everybody has written about that. So, I took a public speaking course and had to do a persuasive speech on I did a persuasive speech on the Pledge of Allegiance. And through that research, I came across a book called To the Pledge, which was a history about the Pledge of Allegiance by Richard Ellis. And he had several pages of high school students and junior high school students who sat during the Pledge of Allegiance as a form of political protest during 1960s and 70s. So I decided to do a paper on that, and make a long story short, the paper wasn't good. It was my first research project, and I just kind of cringed at it then. I still cringe at it now. However, when I was doing the research, I saw so many passing references to high school students involved in like civil rights and anti-war, women's liberation. So it made me wonder, well, how did the Vietnam War affect high school students? So that led to the second book project. And eventually, the dissertation and the book. Of course, the book is way more expansive than the dissertation. What I imagine is nationwide, whereas the dissertation was just strictly the San Francisco Bay Area. And when I was doing the research, one thing I noticed is that teenagers started to develop a unique ideology for their predicament. So after World War II, receiving a secondary education became a much more crucial part for modern citizenship. And particularly when they would bring partisan politics to their schools, they often ran and clashed with administrators who suspended them, expelled them, or disciplined them in some form or fashion, which led them to believe that high schools or secondary schools in general were oppressive institutions. And in this, you get this really radical high school student radicalism that I call this belief that students constitute an oppressed group analogous to poor people, women, and racial minorities, and that you couldn't truly reform society unless you first reformed the high school. So, yeah, you get this what in the book what I call the high school movement. Well, they called it the high school movement, and it's not that they're not adversarial to college students. I mean, they do work alongside with them, but in some communities, high school student activism precedes that of college student activism, or it actually overshadows it, as it does in Los Angeles. And yeah, and throughout the time, there's this realization that if, well, high school students are going to get organized, the people who need to reach out to them are fellow high school students. They're the ones who relate to each other the best. And there's people who I interviewed who, they might have known some college student activists who were only 20 or 21, but being teenagers, they're kind of geriatric. So they thought they were old and saw them as out of touch, even though they're only like maybe 3 or 4 years older than them. So that's something you see, but it's not like a whole lot of tension, but it's really just this unique high school politics that takes place that I talk about in the book that occur all throughout the United States and in public, private, Catholic boarding schools, and believe it or not, even Department of Defense dependent schools, a network of schools that exist in Western Europe and the Pacific. And this was also international phenomenon too. I know from the literature as it stands now, high school student activism occurred in Panama, England, France, Finland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, Ethiopia, South Africa, and that's all I know for currently. So this is not just an American story; it's definitely a global one too.
I mean, and, to that part, right? There was a lot of kind of different entry points from even that response that I think our
Mhm.
conversation can go, right? But to that point, like you use this phrase about like geography is fate in the book, right? To describe, the young activists in different kinds of ways. Um, but at the same time, as you mentioned in your response, the thing about high school student activism and the high school population, especially in relation to a college one, is that there's so much more representation of the kinds of high schools where they exist, where a teenager actually lives, right? Whether it's a small town in the Midwest, a suburb in the South, and all of that changed the way that they saw the world, that they saw their own power. Um, and so I think it's an important part of the book, especially as you mentioned, that this was a project as a dissertation that started in the Bay and then grew outward, right? Because the Bay is unique for all of its own reasons, but what makes the book so powerful is that you can really kind of hone in on just how somebody's individual geography is so different and dictates how they think about activism, how they think about the world, how they think about the problems that they want to give language to. And it can be in the same region or a different region. It can be in the same city or a different city. And so with something like that, like what kinds of, I guess, challenges were presented, right? To make sure that, we could see the kind of differences here, but also what kind of rewards come out. I know the kinds of rewards that when I read it kind of came out from having such a diverse kind of geographic range. But for you, why was it important to kind of have this kind of broad geography represented in the book?
Yeah, that's a good. Glad you asked that question. I haven't got a chance to talk about this. So throughout graduate school, when people would ask me, why the Bay Area, I never really had a good response. I'm like, well, I just picked it. That's just something I did in undergrad. I could decide to continue with it. However, when I would constantly tell people what I researched, and I would say the San Francisco Bay Area, the response was always like, oh yeah, of course. Or it's like, I could see that happening there, but that would never occur where I lived. And I in doing the research, you see these students. It's not that just that activism occurred nationwide, but they also met one another through like conferences, whether they were anti-war conferences, Chicano activism, Black Student Union, student rights, etc. You get people geographically dispersed people just meeting each other, exchanging ideas. Furthermore, through the high school underground press, they also correspond to one another. And when I was getting the FBI files, I originally assumed the FBI would have only spied on students in major metropolitan areas. It was only later, after I came across a police memo from the Pasadena, California police, where I saw investigations that took place in like Norman, Oklahoma, and Aberdeen, South Dakota, a small town in Minnesota. I mean, you name it. So I realized, okay, this is definitely a story that needs to be nationwide. And so I knew early on that I wanted to write a national story. So in grad school, I actually would do research on other parts of the country that I wasn't going to write about in my dissertation. So I really gathered enough research to write 3 books. I did that intentionally. And yeah, by the time when I finished grad school, I just knew there were so many stories I could have told in this book. And I realized that, I just wanted this to be national, be broad, and I wanted to be show how geographically dispersed it was. But more importantly, when you talk about the geography as fate, that's something that Steve Wasserman said when he was recalling his biography. And I kind of realized, like, when I talk to people, I was just in casual conversation, I might talk to somebody who grew up in New Jersey, and they're like, yeah, there wasn't much activism where I grew up, or somebody who grew up in the Bay Area, but they went to a school that didn't have much activism. So I learned, like, okay, not your experience during this era depended not only where you live, but also where you went to school. So I want this to be more as representative as as I possibly can. Not to mention where you went to school. I mean, a chapter I have about Collinwood High School, there wasn't much anti-war activism. It was a lot of Black students defending themselves from white violence that came from students and the parents. However, some students in Cleveland who went somewhere else, they might have been involved in a student walkout. So this is these it's really these hyper local dynamics that shape student activism. And one reason why I really love this subject is because when you study student activism at the high school level, it's not just the history of the school. It's really the history of the community. Talk about people who were born and raised in these communities, so they're interacting with the police department, the city council, the school board, juvenile justice system. You name it. You're learning so much about the history of the community through the experience of youth.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, there's also, the historian or history professor in me always thinks like practically what that means too, right? Like I think, what you're speaking to is just sort of like the massive network that exists at the high school level, right? Or the like ecosystem that kind of exists around these young people. And one of the ways, you excavate that is the question of sources, right? Like, one of the things that you do like really well, and I want to make sure you get time to, show some of these and also talk about this, but it's the underground newspapers, right? Run by teenagers. I think there was like over 900, or it's like a crazy number of them that we see throughout the text. And I think for young people today, especially, like if we think, in this era, long before social media or long before the internet or digital age, right? Like that these kids really use physical papers to build a national community, to help realize that they weren't alone in their beliefs and that they could extend to different parts, right? So this is like a two-part question, right? That on the one hand, that this also is a scary kind of like practical, hey, if you're thinking about a project, think as big as you can, because you know the source space is going to get so vast, right? And then you have to make sense out of all of these sources that you're finding. um but then on the other hand, again, the reward is the source space is so vast. And so you can tell, you can build in these other parts of the conversation, right? You can tell how this small town in the Midwest is connected to major city on the East Coast or major city on the West Coast, et cetera. And so talk to us a little bit about that. Like, how did these kids use these papers to build community um, in those kinds of ways?
Oh yeah, I'm glad you asked me that too, because the high school underground press to me is like one of the most impressive things to come out of this movement. So the title of the book, everybody knows, "High School Students Unite," and it actually comes from this image. You can see this is a high school underground newspaper from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and this image was created in 1968 by the High School Independent Press Syndicate based in New York City, which distribute like leaflets and packages and would report on high school student uprisings throughout the United States. And this image was reprinted in high school underground newspapers from 1968. And although the book I said until 1976, I'd seen this image in an underground newspaper in 1979 from small towns like Lawrence, Kansas to Vancouver, British Columbia. And underground newspapers were pretty much like the most ubiquitous countercultural phenomena you would have seen, and not just in high school, but you can get them on like in churches and gas stations, convenience stores, or on a street corner. They were pretty much everywhere. And students themselves also would form their underground newspapers in response to censorship. Normally, it would just start when a student wanted to write an article in a official campus newspaper, and they just encountered censorship, which made them to create their own newspaper. Now, most were literally just like 1 or 2 page like leaflets. They were not aesthetically appealing, but over time, you would get more sophisticated underground newspapers like the New York High School Free Press. I won't open it because I'll kind of tear it up. This is from 1968, but so they over by 1968 and going on, underground newspapers, at least on the high school level, became much more sophisticated. So the students would they would have like field correspondents, so people who would travel across the city reporting on high school protests occurring at different schools, and they would actually interview the students to learn more about what was going on. They had editorial pages where readers would give feedback, positive and negative. It didn't really matter. Similar to what you would see in any newspaper. They also had photographers who went around the city and took photographs of protests, but also they shared stories of high school protests that occurred elsewhere in the nation to let people know, hey, what's going on in your community and your school is not isolated. This is actually a national and international phenomenon. So in the book, I kind of talk about how these network of underground newspapers form through syndicates. So a syndicate, for those who don't know, is like a newspaper exchange. So let's just say 20 subscribers, they send 5 copies of their paper. I send each copy to every subscriber, maybe some to like another larger syndicate, and I keep a few for myself. That's what high school students do, and that just builds over time. And I talk about this group in founded in Chicago, originally just trying a kid just trying to connect underground newspapers in the Chicagoland area, but he starts getting letters from students from New Orleans and Vermont. And from 69 to 74, he would move around, go to Houston, D.C., and Ann Arbor, Michigan. But over time, he would correspond with 700 like newspapers from over 40 states in the United States, Canadian provinces from Quebec to British Columbia, England, the territory of Puerto Rico, Australia, and New Zealand. And this archive is held at Temple University. It's pretty impressive. A guy I interviewed donated it to them. And when I first got there, they didn't have a catalog. So they forgot that it existed. When I got there, it's amazing. Like these 21 or maybe now 30 boxes of underground newspapers and correspondence. But no, that's how they form with that's how they communicate with one another. It doesn't happen overnight. It usually takes months and years for them to fully have a full-fledged correspondence with one another. But that's pretty much what builds the high school movement. And as I say in the book, there's a saying that you can't talk about the 1960s without talking about the underground press. Well, you can't talk about high school student activism in this era without talking about the high school underground press. These newspapers were ubiquitous, but they were also really controversial. Students who distribute them could get suspended, expelled, or end up in like federal court. As the case actually in Bloomington, Indiana, where there was an underground newspaper called the New American Mercury, and the school administration expelled several of the students. One girl, her parents had to move outside of the city so she can graduate from high school in time. And the mayor went on the local radio station and said he endorsed the expulsion of the students. So these very, very controversial, even though if you read their substance, they actually were very youth oriented. They talked about national politics, local politics. It was young people giving their voices on like youth unemployment, the Vietnam War, civil rights, or any other racial issue, as well as issues related to whatever school they were attending. So, and there were in the book I listed over 1,000 of them. Nobody knows how many existed. There was estimates from 1969. One estimate said there were probably maybe 500 at a given time. Another scholar estimated that there might have been 3,200 of them. In the book, I have about 1,022 names of high school underground newspapers, and that's something I did over the course of 10 years when I visit archives and scroll through microfilm, digitized newspapers, doing interviews, or sitting in a storage closet at a high school in Indianapolis. I would just jot down the name of an underground newspaper. And yeah, I kept this list kind of secret for like 10 years. And I realized I was going to put it in the book. It was kind of hard to keep it guarded that long. I had a student reach out to me from Princeton who wanted to see it. And I'm like, well, no, because it'll just float around and nobody will attribute it to me. So I've seen that story before. I didn't want that to happen.
That's hilarious. And also just wild to think about. And I mentioned kind of things like FOIA and stuff in the kind of
Mhm.
introductory remark, right? Like, and we all, anybody who does research that requires getting access to federal documents, that are tied to surveillance from different kinds of ways. We certainly know just kind of the barriers, right? And so, thinking about that part of it too. Just want to remind people really quick, is if to our listeners, I'm gonna keep throwing Aaron some questions here. We're gonna pivot or transition a little bit from thinking about the book specifically into thinking just more generally. But if you have questions, please, please, please drop them into the question function um, that is on your screen. So last book related question, you kind of, led me here naturally is that like what one of what may be and I'm always careful at book talk like this, right? Because my goal is to get people to want to read the book. So I don't want to like give people the good stuff from the book and then they feel like they don't have to read the book, right? So I just want to give them a little taste of what's in there. But I think one of the more shocking revelations for a general reader is going to be the level of government surveillance on these very young people, right? And you found, right, that FBI monitored hundreds of high school groups, right? And they did so sometimes with the help of parents and teachers acting as informants, right? Um, why do you think that adults and I think this is like the perfect segue question in many ways, right? But why do you think that adults in positions of power are often just so terrified of young people thinking and acting so independently. Um, and in this case, thinking and acting so independently you know, uh, with other young people, right? But that's usually the case. But yeah, so let's just start there. Like, what is it about, again, like, well, I think again, when people read this, the response is going to be like, why are the feds in high schools like at this kind of level? And it's just sort of like, well, the parents and teachers kind of let it, right? And invited it in some ways. And I want to know just, what are your thoughts or what kind of conclusions do you land at when you think about like just the adults in positions of power and ultimately their kind of hesitancy, their reservations, their fear of teenagers, right? Men in this era.
Okay, well, that's a good question. I should say we say teachers. It was mostly administrators. Teachers are far more likely to be like targeted by the FBI than actually work with them. There are many examples in counterintelligence files where employees had their job offers rescinded because of their political activities. But there's some teachers I do talk about in the book who served as informants. So generally, this is true on the college level too. When young people organize politically or start speaking out, it's always believed that somebody had to put that idea in their heads. This is something that's believed across the board. It's nonpartisan. It doesn't matter what you believe politically. People just cannot comprehend the idea of students engaging in politics in a sophisticated way. I mean, the underground newspapers, when people would open them and read them, they were just like, there's no way in the world a teenager could have written this. They were just too sophisticated. The printing was too extensive. But, when you talk to people, you find out that yeah, they had to they printed these underground newspapers off of like mimeograph machines from like civic organizations or sympathetic groups to them or in the Unitarian Church, and sometime without authorizations off the school printer, which we were not supposed to do. And then when they organized groups, adults thought that okay, somebody had to organize them as well. They kind of overestimated how sophisticated a lot of these kids were. In fact, one of the funniest FBI files I've seen. There's a memo where an informant is talking about a meeting of teenagers. And he documents like they talk about this rally that they're organizing, this paper that they're publishing, and he's like the conversation devolved into juvenile subjects. And then it just stops there. He doesn't really elaborate anymore. Now, I should say too for listeners, the FBI is not the only federal law enforcement agency that's spying on teenagers. Local police also have what they call red squads or intelligence units that spy on teenagers and civilians in general. State legislators form like ad hoc committees or sometimes the highway patrol would spy on civilians, including teenagers as well. And the U.S. military had an intelligence wing, and they spied on civilians as well, including teenagers. And not to mention teenagers in Canada, Australia, England, New Zealand were spied on by government institutions as well. And it was literally the same argument that outside agitators were putting them up to it. Interestingly, the lack of credibility in the conspiracy, so lack of evidence just strengthened the conspiracy. So even though they never found that, okay, outside agitators were pulling the string, it just led people to believe that, okay, we just got to look more. So, and they do look more. I mean, these investigations last from 1 month to like 5 years. The FBI files I have, they range from literally 2 pages to 700 pages. They're really impressive to look at because when you read them, you see documents that were not meant for public consumption in them. So I'm pretty sure a parent who wrote a letter to the FBI never imagined little old me would come across it 50 years later. But voila, when you get these FOIA requests, you see letters from parents and intercommunication school files, documents that students produced that are long lost because teenagers did not really keep good records. But what you don't see ever is the evidence that there is a grand conspiracy at hand. All these investigations end with nobody close to cracking the case. And that as this happens throughout. So, but we'll never know the full extent of surveillance because, well, over 100 FBI files, to my knowledge, have been destroyed, and many police departments, military intelligence, and state legislators they long discarded their records as well.
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, that's a tale too familiar to a lot of us who do this kind of work for sure. One of the questions in the chat, Aaron, I want to throw your way before we pivot to some kind of history and the current moment. Is Brooke asks, what was your favorite archive? I think that's a fantastic question to think about. Um, so what was your favorite archive?
No, that was Temple University, the CHIPS Archive, Youth Liberation Archives. Because when I explained earlier about the 700 correspondence with students from across the United States and different countries, that's all there. So you go to a box and you'll pull out a file from like Arizona. You'll see like the SW Sun Press or whatever it's called, and then you'll see like one issue or two issues of the paper. And then you see letters that the student who wrote the paper wrote to the Youth Liberation, explaining like this is what we're writing. These are the issues that we're having. And, someone's been harassed by police, and sometimes they'll ask like, how do you create an underground newspaper? The person I interviewed, Keith Hefner, he called it like the social media of the age. It was literally just this phenomenal collection of young people, teenagers, like writing letters to each other to explain like what issues they were dealing with at the time. And sometimes just curiosity. Like underground newspapers are not all political. Sometimes it was like drama kids who just wanted to write their own underground newspaper. That was my favorite. It was shocking to me that when I got there, they didn't catalog it. So I kind of helped them with some of the folders because they were inaccurate in terms of what they wrote. But by far, that's my favorite archives because you can really spend a whole week or two going through them. It's a really impressive find.
All right, so I know I said we're gonna pivot, but I'm gonna ask one more book related question because it just kind of registered with your last remark. Um, what one of the things that I think you do really well in the book, and again, this y'all need to read it, so I'm not sharing more than I need to, is that you follow many of these activists into their adult lives, and what you learn in doing so is that so many of them become who were politically active at such a young age, like hold on to that, right? Like they become, champions for social justice moving forward, right? And so for our audience today, what does this kind of tell us about the long-term impact of being politically active, starting out at such a young age?
Yeah, I make the point, what it was really important for me because I know in the 1980s there were a lot of these news stories, popular news stories that would focus on like 60s revolutionaries who settled for like conventional lives by selling insurance. Not to say that there weren't people who did that, but at the same time, I'm like, no, this was not a passing phase for people. This literally is like their identity. Of course, you get older, you mature or whatnot, but much of their activism that continued into adulthood was shaped by what they did as kids. So many of these people became academics. It is quite shocking how many names I saw of people whose books I've read, like George Chauncey and Anita Laurel and other academics ranging from community colleges to the top universities in the country. It's quite phenomenal how many people went to academia. And other people, they did journalism. There might be somebody who started off writing an underground newspaper and then literally become a professional journalist. Or one of the most interesting trajectories I've seen was Jeffrey Scale, who at 15 took photographs of the Black Panther Party, many iconic photographs, and later, soon, like maybe a few years ago, retired as the photographer editor of the New York Times. So you see those kind of linkage, and then there's people went into like elected office and became scientists, and even no matter what profession they went into, a lot of them advocated for whatever social justice cause in their field. And interviewing them, what was so interesting is that some people didn't see themselves as activists, but the more they talked, they're like, oh, what I think about it. Yeah, I can see how my activism in my young days influenced my career. And yeah, it was really important for me to talk about where these people ended up in life, just to show that, well, I would say to contradict something that an Uber driver in Indianapolis asked me when I told him about my research. And he said, in a snarky way, what did they grow up to do? Thinking that they didn't grow up to do much. And I rattled off, like, oh, politicians, academics, lawyers. He's like, okay, yeah, whatever.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's no. I could totally see that, right? Especially when you think about, young people from the 60s grow up into a very conservative era of the 80s. It's like, and so it's just naturally like you think like they just get swallowed by the beast when the reality is so many of them spend the rest of their lives trying to fight that beast off. We got a question in the chat here that says, it seems like contemporary younger folks don't recognize their power and how adults are still afraid of them getting politicized. What would you say to an adult who wanted to help foster more activist agency in today's youth?
Oh, I would definitely say, be a guide, but don't try to lead them. You gotta let the young people lead their own way, as many adult activists knew at the time. And they would write that too. That's why the allegation of outside agitators is little. I mean, there was some credibility, but it was really over exaggerated. A lot of adult organizers knew that, yes, we can educate them, we can provide them the materials they need, but at the end of the day, they're the ones that got to do most of the organizing. They got to learn from their mistakes. They got to be able to relate to one another, and they know their issues much better than what many adults do. So, yeah, I mean, nothing wrong being a mentor, but also know like that barrier.
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, I think about that a lot. I think about it a lot as, a professor, as somebody who was active, young, etc. Right? Like I think about like my position now compared to what it was then. And I get to work with obviously college kids are different, but our college students are different, but certainly something I'm always keeping in the back of my mind. Um, we I tell people all the time, sometimes I fight back against the notion when people say like, "Oh my goodness, your research is very timely," right? Because I think what the historian often knows is that it's often more difficult to find the time that it wasn't timely, right? And that's actually what led us to so many of these projects, right? Like that there seems to be like a continuity as much as a kind of change over time. But even with that, Aaron, talk about being more timely than on this particular Saturday. After a Friday in which we saw so many walkouts. We saw a ton of them here across Metro Atlanta. We saw them, across the country, students protesting ICE operations, recent killings in the news. And, one of the things that I think strikes me, when thinking about it both historically but also in relation to this current moment is that we see so many of these similar kinds of phrases, right? We see students use like the phrase silence is complicity, right? To challenge status quo. We see, we see kind of the quote unquote radical political consciousness, mirror the what we see in the 1960s in some ways, right? Where students felt that they were the oppressed group who were going to be responsible for changing society. And so I think about this a lot, and I think about, and so the first question that I'd love for you to kind of think aloud with us as an audience through is, what kinds of lessons are there for students who who were active, and outside yesterday, who might be listening to us right now, but certainly who would benefit from something from the book, right? What is that key lesson, key kind of takeaway for that young person today?
I wrote an article in Time Magazine early last year where I kind of talk about just this, like what lessons can students learn. And one thing I think is important for other people to understand is like the importance of momentum. So generally, when it comes to like a lot of social movement, one of the reasons why many social movements might fail is because you might have this one big walkout and people just kind of go back and do whatever they were normally doing. And amnesia definitely tends to take over when movements don't continue. But activists in the 60s, these movements, they didn't accomplish every single goal they achieved, but they kept applying pressure. They would constantly show up to board meetings. A lot of activism that's very meaningful is very boring and monotonous. I like to joke that I write about really boring stuff, like students going to conferences and writing underground newspaper. It's not the most exciting thing, but when you see those huge walkouts, those huge rallies, it's really that tedious, monotonous work that goes into that for those events to actually form in numbers as large as they do. So I think with these walkouts, they're hype, they're national, they're definitely symbolic, but at the same time, students can change their local environments. I mean, a student walkout in Atlanta is not going to change the predicament of students in Detroit, but a student walkout in Atlanta can definitely change much in the city of Atlanta. So it's up to the students to whatever issues they're protesting or trying to change to apply pressure on their school board. So use whatever access of power you can and make sure that your voices are heard in that regard.
I mean, one of the I'll say this, like, as somebody who's, boots on the ground here in Atlanta, um, I think one of the things that's interesting in thinking about in relation to what high school student activists were experiencing in the 60s, especially, is that a lot of the current protesters were voicing um, the decision that they had to make, right? Like the decision that they had to make with school administrations to, stay on school grounds to avoid suspension, right? And you talk about this a lot in the book, right? As negotiated rights, you describe them. And I think, where students won their freedoms, to your point, were through school board meetings rather than just kind of the court cases. Um, but in some ways, right, the rules of engagement have changed since the era in which you were talking about, right? Like that I think, and one of the ways is that, though it's students in Atlanta who are, at least the students who I'm thinking about, right, are the ones here in Atlanta who are thinking about ICE operations across the country. But it was the ICE operations or the ICE killings specifically in in Minnesota that really kind of, you know, put a put it back on kind of mainstream, right? Like one of the rules of engagement for student protests that have changed is sort of the instantaneous kind of nature and reaction, right? That to your point about like the underground papers needed time to resonate across different space, right? To get, oh, we're gonna do this in Atlanta, you're gonna do this here, etc. But right now it's just like students know that they can connect quickly. And I think that's one way that the rules of engagement for student protests have changed, right? Like just the dissemination of knowledge and accessibility of kind of, you know, access, or that the simple access to certain acts and when, right? Like the ability to unite through technology or technological
Yes.
advancements is probably the biggest one. But so yeah, so to that point, what do you think the rules of engagement have actually changed since the era that you write about in the book?
I'm glad you asked this because I made that point on an NPR podcast early last year, and a guy I interviewed for the second book, who was based in Canada, is like, I kind of disagree with you on that. Technology, yes, it makes it much more easier to connect, but at the end of the day, we are human beings. You got to get out in the streets and you got to talk to people face to face. Nothing's really going to replace that. Yeah, I mean, technology, use it at your advantage, but at the end of the day, yeah, you got to put your body on. And that's what he told me too. He's like, I just can't. No, that's what we had to do in the '60s. He thinks that's the same thing that works currently today, even with the technological advances that makes connecting with one another much more easier to do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's real, right? Like it's skin in the game, right? You still need skin in
Mhm.
the game. Um, to your point about, and again, I'm just talking here because I'm looking at the chat and I would love more questions to flow in, but I can also keep our conversation going. But so people listening, if there are questions, don't forget, drop them in there. Um, in the you brought up, in our conversation a bunch, and obviously it's a thread throughout the book, right? That people school boards were often convinced that outside agitators were brainwashing kids, right? Um, we see that today, right? That is certainly a similarity between then and today, right? Like this notion of outside agitators exists in college protests, high school protests, you name it, right? Um, and the students are actually pushing back against this in the same kinds of ways, right? Insisting that this is their own movement. Um, Based on your research, why does this tension just keep repeating itself, right? Because this is about it being timely, but it's also just a tension that just seemed to have never gone away, right? Between adult guidance and student autonomy, or just thinking that students can't do these things for themselves.
No, this just wouldn't. people who lack power challenge power. This is pretty much how people in power react to any movement that challenges the status quo. It's not just students. I mean, it's just, as you know, civil rights protester. There's all these Northerners coming out and stirring all our good Negroes up. You think of like labor protests, and students. It just takes on this whole naivety, or they're naive because they're young, but at the same time they are a powerless people questioning people in power, and people in power assuming that somebody or something is putting them up to it. Because I remember seeing this when the during the pro-Palestine protests at Columbia University, where like, oh, it's just somebody putting ideas in their head, and somebody like, this is offensive, like just saying young people can't think for themselves. But there were protests on high school campuses as well that were also local stories, and it was the same allegation. In my book, that's a charge that never really dies. There are some adults who recognize that, oh no, the students who are protesting, they do have legitimate grievances. There are school boards who sometimes believe that the students have legitimate grievances, but even then, they can't get this idea out their head that, okay, somebody has to be putting them up to this, because why on earth are they just causing a ruckus right now? But they totally ignore how organic these issues were. And the outside agitator allegation is it's much more psychologically smoothing for people in power to do than to actually investigate and realize, like, oh, hey, some of our actions make us a little complicit in whatever predicament that the students are complaining about. So I don't think it's going to die, but at the same time, it's not an excuse to not challenge power.
Yeah. Yeah. One of like so and to that point, right? This is kind of going to take us back to one of the early questions, but thinking
Mhm.
about in relation to today, especially, is that we often think of the '60s as an era of intense racial polarization, right? But one of the things that I think comes out throughout the book is that the diversity in coalition building amongst young people is phenomenal, right? That it is, that young people are able to bridge racial divides, geographic divides, class divides, in ways that adults in their communities seem unable or at least unwilling
Mhm.
to overcome. Um, and in some ways we can look to young people for that same kind of diverse coalition building today. Um, but to your point about, one of the things that change as people get older is people tend to, start to live amongst themselves a little differently, right? That diversity in coalition building tends to look a little different. For older people because largely because of proximity, right? Like there's something about natural about like the high school that allows for it to happen organically. And so I mean thinking about that kind of broad connection between just sort of diverse coalition building in politically charged times and racially polarized times, whatever you want to, whatever angle you want to take it, like what can be learned from, I guess, the young people and how they do that so effectively, um, that most movement organizing, outside of the high school space can kind of benefit from.
Yeah, I mean, they have more diverse shared space than most adults. Too, you get older, your friend group's not probably as diverse as they were when you were a kid. Now, I don't want to romanticize it, 'cause I know I talk about in the book the high school Bill of Rights campaign in Philadelphia. How you get this diverse coalition of students in a city that's marked by racial polarization to challenge the school board and pass this Bill of Rights document that they proposed. But some cities that's not really the case. I think, like, groups I talk about in the book, like, Minnesota Student Union, they were primarily an all-white group, and black students really didn't care for them because they thought the issues that they addressed were a little frivolous compared to the issues that they thought were much more important. Not to mention, this is also a time when there's a lot of violence in high school. And I know there's a burgeoning scholarship on black rebellions, and I've seen maybe two works that examine the high school angle. I think that's definitely a lot of room for growth to see how politicized these school-based riots were. But no, there definitely is some coalition. There is definitely some interracial and interethnic coalition building. And a lot of it is it's not the majority of students. It's like a minority of a lot of left-wing students who realize that they have shared grievances and form these independent student organizations or underground newspapers, and talk about the issues that they have as students, but also at the same time they're cognizant of like racial aspects. Like the one group the person, Steve Wasserman, his group that he founded, the Berkeley High School Student Union, in their pamphlet, they acknowledge that we must address racism in this the broader society, but also within ourselves. So they realize like, hey, we're still byproducts of our environments, and yeah, there are attitudes we have that we have to fight against. So there is this awareness that yeah, we're not perfect either. We have to work against it as well. So you see some of that, but again, as you say, geography is fate. It depends where you grew up. Yeah, where you grew up, definitely. Because some communities that was much easier to do that. Others that would have been almost nearly impossible.
Yeah, 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 yeah. There, there's a question in the chat that said, were there moments where the archive surprised you? And if so, what did you find?
Oh, a moment when the archive surprised me. Well, I mean, the archive surprised me the most was the FBI FOIA stuff because those documents, a lot of the underground newspapers, leaflets, and pamphlets or whatever, some of them are, I've never seen them anywhere else but the FBI file. So, like in the first chapter, I talk about a high school group in San Francisco that launches a free speech campaign. They publish like 10 copies of an underground newspaper called the Activist Opinion. I've seen all 10 copies, but about 4 or 5 of them I've only seen in the FBI file. Never nowhere anywhere else. And I contacted 10 people who belonged to that group, and neither of them had every single issue in their possession. So I would say that's probably what surprised me the most. It was not just the FBI spied on it, but it's like, oh my goodness, like, I talk about a story in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I didn't have to go to Albuquerque because well, the school administrators were really diligent in collecting all the materials that students were publishing. So that was a surprise to me. Of course, not all FBI files are as rich, but no, the FBI FOIA documents, that was kind of like a private archive I just kind of created and was able to, I use throughout the book, even when I'm not talking about FBI surveillance directly.
Yeah, we just got a follow-up question in the chat too that kind of fits naturally here
Mhm.
about, can you say anything about your methods and approach to reviewing so many FOIA documents, and how were you able to make sense of that volume of records?
Okay, so wait, repeat the question because I was kind of like misunderstood.
So can you say anything about your methods or approach to reviewing so many FOIA documents, and how were you able to make sense of that volume of records?
Oh yeah, well, so I kind of learned not early on, but later to not assume what group might have had an FBI file. So the list I had, the list in the back of the book, I submitted a FOIA request on every single group and underground newspaper that's in that book. And of course, high schools that experience some form of social unrest. Well, when you're reading FBI documents, I know historians dismiss them often because yes, they're very inaccurate. They misspell names. They say things that just aren't true. I've shared them with people, and they're like, "Where did they get this from?" But I was kind of, reading against the grain. I was reading to see what were the motives and beliefs of like agents who wrote these memos, of the parents and school administrators, and yes, even student informants who contacted them. Like, a 200-page file, like I would say maybe 100 pages, I'm not paying much attention to because it's kind of just monotonous FBI jargon. But the stuff where they're corresponding with like just ordinary people, that's what I pay most of my attention to. So I kind of use it just to fish information to understand the motives of people, not to let the FBI serve as like a narrative or what these groups were doing, because I know that's already kind of inaccurate.
Yeah, I'll say this, and I'm just looking at time, so we'll wrap it up here shortly. Yeah, that went quick. But uh you know, when I was finishing my first book, there was a group of us, there was in some ways the Carmelo Anthony, LeBron James, Dwayne Wade trifecta who was writing a book on New York, LA, and Chicago, like on policing in different kinds of ways. And one of those, scholars, Max Felker Cantor, who wrote a book about policing Los Angeles, um, he just received a FOIA request last week that he filed in 2017. Um, and so, I mean, there's that part of the FOIA battle, right? Is that you know you can put in a request, and sometimes they feel like they enter the abyss, right? It's hard to kind of keep track. It's hard, and it's easy kind of lose sight. And even if you don't lose sight, it's just part of the I think it's a very deliberate tactic from the feds in terms of opening up access to particular files and them taking as long as they do. Like I think that's also very deliberate and tactful, and useful for their end from their end. And then nothing more frustrating than waiting for a file for as long as you do to get something that's like fully redacted or nearly all redacted, et cetera, right? And just the uselessness behind that. And so I don't know if you have similar kind of experiences with those, but are but that is certainly a struggle with FOIA research.
Oh no, it definitely occurs. It takes 2 to 6 years. There's some documents I'm still waiting 11 years later. And what I will say, if you get a FOIA request directly from the FBI, that's going to be far more redacted than something that comes from the National Archives. It's slower because of the pandemic and the government layoffs. I just got a FOIA request that I submitted for in 2018, and I knew the layoffs were having an effect because there were things that should have been redacted that weren't. So I'm kind of like, oh, okay, it's a little weird. I'm like, okay, it's
Yeah, yeah.
definitely taking a toll on them, but it told me much more information than I probably would have got.
Yeah. Yeah. So last question from the chat and then ER if you want to hop back on. Um Aaron, can you tell us a little bit about how you trained or learned to conduct interviews because interviews are tricky?
Yeah, I first started when I was an undergrad, but I remember my professor, he taught me how to do it. But I remember I interviewed somebody, she complained. She was like, oh, you historians, why do you think everybody knows all the social context at a given moment? So, and I'm like, okay, yeah, she got a point. It was really when I watched the Columbia University or oral history, the Center of Oral History at Columbia University when they interviewed members of the New York High School Student Unions and they did biographical interviews. And I thought, like, oh, that's actually a much more better way to interview people. So I learned from that. I also learned from the University of California Conversation with History, where they do biographical interviews. And I follow the Larry King rule, where like I try not to ask a question that's more than like 2 sentences. So I always ask open-ended questions, and I start with the childhood one because I think it's a very softball question. You get to know them as a person, but you also get to see how talkative they are. And then after that, I go, I usually I talk, yeah, the childhood, and then I'll talk about the parents, and then I go into like more specific questions about whatever topic that we're talking about. And it really is chronological the way I follow it. Of course, interviewing people, some people will literally talk. You'll ask them one question, they'll talk for an hour. Other people, they're very taciturn. They're like, well, I'm born this year, my dad did this, my mom did this. What else you want to know? So I'm like, okay. Let me just make sure I ask a lot of follow questions for this person. So yeah, you never know what you're going to get when you talk to somebody until you actually interview them. But I did find biographical methods, even they're telling me information that's not really important, to be quite helpful. But when you read the book, you'll learn a lot about the biographies of these people. I wanted to write a very character driven narrative of these stories rather than traditional academic writing where you give 3 dozen examples to uphold the argument.
All right, last comment there, ER before you jump in. I saw you just logged it back on. Were there folks who refused to talk to
Oh,
you?
yes, and for different reasons. So I know one person. He didn't tell me this. A friend of his, a childhood friend, told me he had a pretty traumatic childhood. So that's probably why he didn't want to talk to me. Sadly, I would get in contact with people who were interested and told me like, oh yeah, I got like 2 boxes of underground newspapers from like the state of Florida. And I'm like, oh my god, that's so great. I live in DC. Let me just come up to Philly. And then for whatever reason, they just stopped responding to my emails till this day. So most people will never tell me why, and other people are just not interested. They might think the topic's not interesting. It varies. I've kind of learned that if somebody doesn't want to talk to you, just move on because the interview is going to be just horrendous if you try. But the people who are ecstatic, those tend to be the best interviews.
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, I could totally see that. Cool. I think we're just good on time a little bit. ER. I think we went over a
No,
couple minutes, but nothing
no,
too
it's
well. All
perfect.
right.
Perfect.
Yeah.
You're an excellent interviewer, and Aaron, you're an excellent interviewee. So I really enjoyed listening to this conversation. I just dropped the link to Dr. Suddler's book in the chat, so we encourage you, if you can, to buy that from Charis. And you can click the teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy High School Students Unite from Charis as well. These are also don't necessarily have academic book money, but this is a thing that you could go to your school librarian and say, hey, I'm interested in reading this book. Could you help me get it? And what we hear from librarians all the time, both at the high school level and the college level, is it is really valuable to them when they can show that a student is requesting books like this. They say, "You're never bothering me, please," because it helps them fight book bans. It helps push back. They say, "No, we have students who want to write reports on stuff like this." So don't ever be shy about that if you're a young person. I consistently get librarians telling me that. Please tell young people to come and ask for the books they actually want. So um, it's a great way to support authors as well, and to help make sure that books that we're interested in actually continue to get published. So, and of course, if you do have money, buy some books, because that also helps. And we appreciate that. So thank you both for your time tonight. We look forward to your future work. I hope that we'll get to host you in Atlanta for real next time, Aaron. Um, and thank you to our partners at Vox. I really appreciate everyone. Thank you, Brooke, for being with us from Vox tonight in the chat and in the green room. Vox is an incredible organization. I really encourage folks to support Vox, donate to Vox, and if you have young folks in your life, send them to Vox, because they will learn some really important skills around media literacy and telling their own stories in their own voices, which is a really important skill right now. So thanks so much, y'all. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.